Hello, welcome. Today I would like to answer the question which I received from some of you asking about interest rate risk in the banking book and asking some specific questions, very good questions, regarding managing of IRBP exposure. Today's question was why Treasury deploys synthetic hedges, which are derivatives. We are managing the exposure through derivatives. So I imagine as opposed to the natural hedging, because we have these two groups of hedges. The first group is synthetic hedge, which means we are using the derivatives, which interest rate swaps are the most common one, swaptions and forward starting swaps. These are instruments which we are using on the daily basis in Treasury, as opposed to the natural hedging. And this is quite important thing, because normally a Treasury should be managing interest rate risk exposure in the banking book through natural strategies. So natural strategy means I'm using the portion of fixed rate assets to offset the exposure driven by fixed rate liabilities. So basically I'm using the items on the balance sheet to match and to mitigate the time bucket sensitivity, which is coming from open position. So for example, as you can see on this presentation, I have the fixed rate asset with the repricing tenor of 10 years, and it is funded by the liability, fixed rate liability with tenor of 5 years. And there is obviously the open risk position from year 5 onward, because there is no liability. So in order to, natural hedging will be trying to match those tenors and to use the existing items on the balance sheet to offset the time bucket sensitivity. But the problem is, it is not always possible, because if I'm originating 5-year assets and I want to hedge it naturally, so I want to manage the exposure through the liability side, I would need to originate a 5-year liability to hedge this exposure naturally. However, just in case of smaller banks, when we have no access to the capital market, and we are competing with other banks to originate the liability, the deposits usually, because this is how and it is not always possible to get volumes in deposits for 5 years, for example, for fixed time deposits, because there is no appetite in the market, in the customers. So from the customer side, from depositor side. So this is exactly the point. There is not always the possibility to hedge it naturally. Synthetic hedge is exactly for this reason. You don't need the item on the balance sheet, because you are executing the swap. You are entering into the payer swap when you need to hedge the fixed rate asset, or you are entering into the receiver swap if you want to hedge or if you need to enter the receiver swap because you are hedging the liability side. So this is why we are not always using the natural hedging, because it's quite difficult to match it precisely, but the objective from Treasury should be trying to manage it on the net basis through the natural structure of the balance sheet. Only the residual exposure, which is on the balance sheet, should be managed through synthetic hedges. As I said, it's not always possible, and sometimes you have the evolution of the exposure of your balance sheet. So basically at one point of time you are hedging the liability side because this is your exposure, because for example you are funding the floating rate assets with fixed rate deposits or fixed rate liabilities. So then you have the exposure, your net liability position on the medium long end of the curve. Therefore, you will be entering the receiver swaps in order to mitigate the time bucket sensitivity on the long end of the curve. So this is why it's, as I said, it should be the residual position which is hedged. But through time, maybe you start having more fixed rate asset than liabilities, and then you need to enter the payer swap because you will be hedging the asset side, because you become net asset position rather than net liability. So in this case, you will have the two groups of swaps. You will have the receiver swaps because your exposure, your legacy book will be this receiver swap, and you will have the payer swaps, which are hedging your exposure to the fixed rate assets. The second question which I have received, I hope this answers your question. The second question was related to the non-interest bearing liability, and it was driven by or related to the structural hedging. The structural hedging is quite interesting hedging program, and there is a lot of information, and it's really very good hedge if you enter the hedge in the right time, and if you there is the outlook, the interest rate environment, external environment, which support you with these hedges. Otherwise, it's not fit for purpose. So it has to be executed, and first of all, you need to have the non-maturing deposits, and non-maturing deposits are always modeled. So you are identifying the fixed portion and fixed portion and volatile, so floating. Yeah, you could say floating, but I rather call it volatile portion. And the core portion. The core portion is allocated to the longer time buckets on the repricing gap. So you are modeling them. You are equally distributing this core portion across the time buckets. And then you are entering the portfolio of receiver swaps, which are mimicking the exposure or the modeling of your current accounts on the liability side. And basically it is when the swap is maturing, you are entering another swap at the tenor which you attributed to the non-interest bearing current accounts. So this is obviously the management of the risk. In this way, you are stabilizing the margin, and you are also hedging your balance sheet from the potential rates moving down. So I will be recording the session on structural hedging in detail, and because it's such an important topic and it's not easy one. So I'm going to dedicate the proper time to this topic. But the question was also, we are talking about non-interest bearings, so how you apply the hedge accounting to this. So this is slightly different topic, but you can apply hedge accounting. Hedge accounting is here for the assets which you are hedging rather than liabilities, because you are applying the cash flow hedging of your asset side. You cannot apply the fair value hedging for something which like equity or NIPCA. So mostly applying what I have seen the cash flow hedging on your asset side. So basically you are transforming your floating rate asset into the fixed rate assets, and this is what you are trying to account for during your cash flow hedging strategy of the asset side. So yeah, it's I would go with cash flow hedging at the same time, like you would do for the pipeline hedging when you don't have the asset on the balance sheet because it's in the pipeline and you cannot deploy then the fair value hedging. So you will be going through cash flow hedging of your liability side. And this is because it's you need to have the item on the balance sheet in order to identify the hedged and hedging item. So I hope I answered your question. If you need any details regarding the hedge accounting, this is a slightly different topic because hedge accounting is quite it's important, very important, and it's a wide topic, covers different aspects, and mainly of the accounting of these derivatives, which you are using for the management of the interest rate risk. But the objective, meanwhile, in our sessions, I'm usually talking about the risk management purposes or potential profitability enhancing tools such as derivatives, and when to use them for these purposes, and where and what is the strategy. Hedge accounting is for mainly accounting issue in such a way that you obviously you don't have the P&L volatility on your balance sheet, and this is the main objective of the hedge accounting. Meanwhile, the risk objective is to manage the interest rate risk. However, yes, in this case, you need to go with the cash flow hedge accounting strategy. Thank you very much. I hope it helped. And I'm going to register or record the session on the pipeline hedging through swaption as already mentioned. Thank you very much.